Hello, hello, and here we are. I've got this guy, he's currently chained to the desk. There is no escape for him. Please welcome Chris Keyens, Meyer. Meyer? How do you say that? Meyer. Okay. And I'm Brass, of course. Very happy to be here. I've been having a really fun time following along on the live stream question thread that we posted on the forums. And we have one... Are we allowed to use slightly, PG-13, right? We have one shit ton of questions. To give you some idea, these are all the questions that came in. I'm going to guarantee that we are not going to have time to answer all of these questions on this one stream. But most of them are really well thought out, smart questions, some very interesting topics for us to discuss. So we are here today on the Rift live stream to discuss balance. As most of you know, that's going to pertain to class balance.
I forgot the most important tool for talking about balance, which is the Magic 8 Ball.
The Magic 8 Ball. I've got the most important tool for talking about class balance, which is my trusty cider mug. So, hello, it's happy hour at Trion. I hope you guys are happy to be here too.
She didn't bring me any, because community hates Deb, apparently.
Seriously. You can get your own darn drinks. They're right over there. Everyone else is helping themselves.
I mean, now it's too late.
Okay, so what we're here to talk about is, of course, class balance in Rift. And we're not going to be able to waste too much time here, so we're going to get right into it. One of the things that I need you to know, because I've worked on a couple of different games myself, is that the Rift devs do not operate in a vacuum. They all have a breadth of experience in a number of different games, a number of different genres and types of games. Chris, tell us a little bit about what games you've worked on in the past.
So specifically, my entire career in the industry has been on MMOs. So I worked at Cryptic before this. I worked on Champions. I've done some work on Star Trek Online, or for them more specifically. And I worked most heavily on Neverwinter when I was over there. So.
Neverwinter, yeah. Lots of fun. I think some of us have, actually, I've played all of those games. That's cool. And the other devs on the Rift team have the same breadth of experience as well. So they're not just inventing stuff. They're building on what they've learned at other companies, on other titles, and everybody talks to everybody else. Plus, we all play other people's games. So when we see something really cool in another game, you know we're going to try to find a way to bring some of that brilliance over to Rift as well. Now, working on all these different projects, how has that affected your approach, your personal approach to class balance?
So it's actually interesting. For Rift specifically, it uses what's generally called a free-form power selection system. So instead of, when you think of World of Warcraft, you think of the classes being pretty fixed. And you don't really get a lot of choices. That's a pretty strongly delineated class system. Rift has a much more open system where players can decide what abilities they want. And we do structure it with the root and the branches. But you get a lot of flexibility in what abilities am I taking and what abilities am I not taking. And both Neverwinter and Champions were various forms of the freeform power selection system. So I actually have a fair amount of background in systems that match this pretty specifically. And it has an interesting catch-22 that is, the more freedom we give players, the less balance we can reasonably accept. So there's a weird mixing pot of either we have to put new, powerful tools way out of player reach, or we have to, just accept certain difficulties. And so Rift is kind of playing this balancing act between what's really fun and exciting and gives you choices, and what keeps the game from just being wildly out of control.
Right. So now, do you actually even know, because I didn't have time to count before we started the stream, how many souls do we have in Rift now?
There are 11 souls, each in the 4 basic callings and 7 in Primalist. So 44 plus 7 is
7. Okay,
51.
so 51 souls.
Yeah.
With 51 souls, how on earth can you even approach class balance?
So it does help that they're not all different classes, right? So warriors only have 11, primals only have 7, etc., etc. Right. That helps a lot, because we only have to think about what would you reasonably take. So when we're talking about the best possible damage build, or, we don't really have to worry about how War Chanter impacts that. It does a little bit in certain cases, but for the most part, it's not really a thing. So you think about it, there's only really 4 or 5 different permutations of change there that actually matter. And so we get to narrow that down a lot, but it's still a lot of choices that players get to make, and it's very hard to balance, because when a hybrid does pop up that's better than the 61-point option, it's pretty hard to rein it in without breaking both of the souls that are involved.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So we tend to move power out of their reach, and it tends to cut down on the number of hybrids. And this is the more balanced you want the game to be, the less prevalent hybrids are going to be, because it's very difficult to design for hybrids. We've tried to keep some of them. Rogues have kind of some of the more notable ones there with Ass Dancer and Shade Dancer and a couple other things.
Yes, he said that out loud. Ass Dancer with a straight face.
Yeah, that's the name of the build.
Oh yeah, I know.
Blade Sin just doesn't. It's not the same.
I agree. Yeah.
And so we've tried to keep those things relevant, but it's very difficult because when they tend to be relevant, they tend to be the best option, and they tend to have higher complexity because they're drawing from lots of different elements of different classes that aren't necessarily designed to mesh with each other. So it is a tough balancing act between how much do we want to push you towards pick a core soul that is where 58 to 61 of your points go, and then where are your sub-points going for utilities, versus, oh, we really want, all these 30 and 40 point hybrids to exist. And it's really difficult to design specifically for small hybrids.
Right, okay. So now, our fellow players, hi, all you guys out there, they get understandably attached to their preferred play styles. But Rift allows you to change your soul spec almost how many? Is there a limit to how many different specs you can have on your soul?
I believe you can have 20 rolls.
20 rolls. Okay, that's
might be 40.
That's fairly significant.
We upped it recently, so.
I'll admit that because I'm an altaholic. Hi, my name is Brass, and I'm an altaholic. I have 3 different clerics, I have 2 different warriors, and so on. But most people can just switch back and forth between their roles. I don't like doing that because I got to change my wardrobe and all that stuff. Role player.
You can save wardrobes,
I know you can, but it's a pain in the ass. I just want to switch, different name, different role play, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, but can you comment about the perceived need to have specific soul builds and abilities for certain content? Sometime where you might take your favorite druid build, but you may feel that you have to do a different build in order to succeed in an encounter.
So there's going to be a gradient of how powerful any given build is, and it's pretty fixed up to the best possible thing that calling can do, and non-functional, right?
Right.
So if you're talking about, I'm going to take my 2 healer subsoul, 15 crazy point spread solo build, and I want to participate in raids,
Gotcha,
you're really going to struggle because we can't. There's no way to make that viable there. So there are going to be builds that are better tuned for specific things, and we can't really get away from that as a design element because the game is mathematically deterministic for the most part. Player skill matters, but in the kick it in the shins until it's dead part of the game, that numbers matter. So it's really hard to get away from that as far as things that do more damage. You're going to feel more effective at that.
Right, because there is a degree of, and I'm not a min-maxing player, but if you are, and there's a lot of you guys out there because I've seen the math you do on the forums, you have to pick the precise build that's going to optimize your damage or healing output or whatever it is you're doing, and then you have to pair that with the gear that supports that, and so it can be challenging. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need.
So there are certain builds that provide unique tools that are very helpful. For example, if you know you're going to need spot healing, and you don't, and you either need to, you're going to be away from healers, or you won't have access to a healer, picking up a healing subsoul can be really useful for that. You are going to sacrifice damage by doing so. So in cases where you don't need that, it's not a very good choice. But there could be encounter designs that say, hey, if you can get a cleanse or a heal or something this low in the tree, it's pretty useful. But cases like that tend to break other elements of the game, right? We had a problem with Warriors where War Chanter had a low-hanging fruit choice of a finisher in I'm With You. And because it was off global cooldown, only consumed a single attack point, and was relatively energy efficient for anyone not using the deep rest mechanic, you basically would spam it. And that's terrible because it breaks PvP, right? It's a self-healing warrior that pumps out a moderately, dangerous amount of damage and is very hard to kill compared. So sometimes we have to take those tools away, and so balancing where they live and where they don't, we tend to fall back on the Trinity as a design element for encounter design because of that.
So you've got the holy trinity of tank, cleric, damage.
Yep. And supports for the sake of this tend to be considered like damage because they're force multipliers. They either tend to make healers better or tanks better or damage dealers better.
Right. Now, we talk a lot about synergies in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Are the synergies, are they things that you intentionally build in when you guys are deciding on class balance? Or are some of these things that pop up accidentally where players build a certain combination and you go, that's pretty awesome.
So stuff that's in Soul tends to be on purpose. We focus on those things. So for example, one of the changes we made to the 61 legendary for Assassin, I blanked on it for a second there, was to increase all their damage over time. And they have a fair number of damage over time effects, but they weren't adding up to a huge amount of your total damage. And we wanted to spread out that damage a little bit more. And that's an intended side effect, right? What it does mean is that if you pick up a dot from somewhere else, it might be more valuable. Now I think that's currently scoped to Assassin dot specifically. I'd have to check. But there are cases, where this just increases this type of damage, and using that in a subsoul might be very useful. I fixed a Primalist bug today, reworked Primalist bug today, that someone wanted to use in a single target or cleave soul that they weren't really getting to use, and Typhoon had a problem where a particular buff wasn't working right, and so I fixed it to reset the cooldown instead of making instant cast because it was various reasons. Anyway, that's fixed, and that will allow that to be used in some souls where it wasn't really intended, but provides a unique synergy.
For those of you who may not have been to the forums today, Keyens has actually put in the public test server shard, as you know, there are some class balance changes coming or on public test server, and he just made a brand new post there, added onto the previous ones of changes that he's putting in now. So this is it's an evolving process. I think I'm just going to go straight into the questions now, because there's a lot here that have questions that I was planning to ask you anyway. So Hepatits, really? Did your mama name you that? Hepatits asks, how do you test specific specs and how well they'll perform? Do you have a parse simulator? Maybe an executable spreadsheet for specific rotations? If it exists, does it include a lag factor, etc.?
So there's a couple different elements here. We do have a bunch of internal spreadsheets that do a fair amount of magic, and when we talk about lag and other things, we tend to have what we call a fudge factor. This is human error.
Confirmed, fudge factor.
I mean, it's a lot of people call it different things. But
Yeah.
It's anywhere from 8 to 12% for average players, which includes things like latency and player skill and a couple other things. But these spreadsheets are not end-all be-all. They actually tend to miss a lot of things because they're purely mathematic. So what we generally do is the same players who are in our alpha test group, who are longtime veterans, who we've basically handpicked for certain stuff, they basically get a very fixed test case that I've constructed and said, this is the gear you wear, you all wear the same thing, here's the test case, here's how long you parse for, here's the dummies you're hitting, here's where you're doing it, and I tend to oversee those manually. I tend to sit in PTS with them. And the reason we do it that way is that it actually helps eliminate a huge variable, which is player skill. It's very hard to eliminate player skill and how accurately players follow a test case. I could put a test case on the forums and say everybody has to do this, but if one requires dev intervention, which this one in specific does, it's impossible to get good parses because players will just parse on whatever's available. It's also hard to make sure that people are using the test case as provided. In this case, we tend to force their characters to exist in a particular way. So in this alpha, we put every character, they had to be brand new, they had to be empty, and we force leveled them to 70 and then gave them fixed gear that they couldn't change.
So that you're comparing apples to apples all the time.
So that
no hidden factors.
Right. So when people ask for what's the damage target number for this pass, there's not a good answer to give you. In the specific test case, we're looking at plus minus 10% of a target. And if you're not using that specific test case, your numbers will be different, and it's kind of irrelevant what you get there.
All right, so Rascal asks something here, Rascal360. If I out DPS Dart Demon, does that mean I could be an alpha tester? How does someone get involved in helping
So
me test?
this tends to be long-term players who have a very good positive record on the forums. So there's more than just do I hit the buttons harder.
Right.
That's not what we're looking for. One, because it doesn't profess great knowledge, right? You can master a rotation without understanding the underlying. We tend to, this is a process that Vlad and I and other developers have looked at and said, these are players we want and have done well. They're well behaved. They don't get infractions on the forums. They're helpful. And so there's a lot of things that go into picking that. And, alpha players do cycle out eventually. Sometimes they drop out of the game. Mm-hmm. And so we do replenish those channels periodically with more players. But unless we're actively, looking for people, we don't really just add people at random.
And that reminds me, of course, Shanoa HK asked, does Keyens have help? And yes, you work with pretty much everybody on the dev team, don't you?
Yep.
So tell us some of your interactions. For instance, they're building a raid right now. So what is your interaction going to be in testing the various builds against this raid to make sure that the raid is somewhat doable now that we don't fall through the
most
ground?
most commonly, I work with the raid guys and the content team. Art doesn't care as much what I'm doing, but especially environment, they don't give at all.
Got it. Yes.
So when I talk to the raid guys, I look at the encounter designs. I try to give feedback about, hey, this is too punitive to melee. Ranged has a huge advantage here. Casters have a huge advantage. Instant cast has an advantage here. Things like that. And you can circumvent these mechanics this way. Or so when we look at, for example, Belagosh has on the PTS a new mechanic that he didn't have in our first test, which is, hey, if you're too close to him, all of your cast times are increased by 50%. And the reason we added that was the way we were doing it on in our test that we suggested was stack everybody up so we never saw this particular mechanic that he only uses on ranged players. So forcing players to spread out causes them to do, that mechanic. And so that's one of the things we do is we go back and forth. It also helps make balance considerations for, hey, we think we're going to use AoE more heavily here, or we're not going to use AoE more heavily here. And so do these souls need these tools? Can we move away from these tools? These are things we think in kind of a meta sense as well. So
right, and I have to also say that the people who work in this company are every bit as passionate as every one of you guys, because I'm watching the internal discussions going on as people are having very heated and interesting discussions about balance and how we approach various encounters.
There's
and so
a question here I want to hit.
Yes.
Kipro asks.
Yes, this was actually on here too.
That I ignore all the parses from people that are not in the alpha group. That is, for the most part, true. We don't really use just raw parses because they lack information and they lack context. However, you should not ignore testing the specs. One, you can find bugs. Bugs are going to happen. Software is very complicated. The ability system is really complicated. There's going to be bugs. The more people hitting it, the more bugs we're going to find. We also want people testing for feel. Sometimes a change we make for purely balance reasons is going to make a spec not fun to play. And so we need to figure out a way to solve that problem. And sometimes that means we have to get real clever with the way we make changes. And so don't stop testing. It's not helpful to post just parses and what you think should change. Giving feedback is a really difficult skill. It takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of practice. But the best way to give feedback is to talk about why you expected a different behavior and why you feel something happened, not what you think should change. Because what you think should change, one, we might have already had that idea and had a reason we can't do it, or it might not be feasible within the engine. But if you talk about, this made me feel this way, we can look at saying, hey, this is the underlying cause of that and fix that. So, for example, if you say, I think these abilities should do more damage and these ones should do less, and what you mean is, the way it's balanced right now, I never press these buttons and they feel bad, or it makes me a one-button spec, or whatever it is. If you instead say, hey, this is what's actually happening here, we can say, okay, we're going to rebalance some of that. So Marksman got some of this. All of their damage was in empowered shot, and all of their damage was in their finisher. And so they stopped pressing barb shot, which is sad. So I made a change to barb shot to cause it to basically be a damage amplifier that you want to keep up. This makes the spec a little more active. It makes it a little more, you got to track a buff. And if it's still not fun, then that's something we can approach. But it means that we can spread out damage and we can make specific design targeted changes rather than just trying to decipher what your meaning is.
All right, so Cloud also submitted a tremendous number of questions, and some of them are going to be answered in other sections, so I'm just going to go with a few of these. What new specs in 4.0 were unexpected surprises?
Tactician did way better than we expected.
We're going to go back to that soon, because there's a lot of questions about, and we might as well ask that now. Yeah. A number of players who posted in the thread asked, are we going to nerf Tactician? Yes. Are there going to be... as
of today,
go enjoy it now. Oh, it got nerfed?
Yes.
On live?
So, no.
On PTS.
No, sorry, PTS.
Okay.
PTS today they got nerfed. So the main difference there is we changed a lot of things all at once. And we made their healing better with a legendary. We changed how Curative Torrent targets players. So before, Curative Torrent, when it bounced, would just say, find the nearest two players. So if the nearest two players had full health, it would just say, I found the nearest two players. It tries to heal them with overhealing and does nothing. Now it's a smart heal. So it says, find the nearest two players who are damaged. And it will sort by lowest health. So it finds the lowest health players within radius. And so it's wildly more efficient now. But we never changed it to account for that. And it was way better than it used to be. So because its healing efficiency went up by, almost a whole factor. It was almost 10 times more efficient. we didn't really account for that appropriately, and so in cases where flavors were stacked up, it's just the best thing, better than anything else.
Okay, so let me do my impression of tacticians right up until this morning. Woo! 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 And this morning, oh.
Yeah.
Right?
So you will have to push more of your buttons now to
Okay.
heal people.
So
But
no more hands in the air.
Curative Torrent's still good. I mean, it's still a
Okay.
smart heal. It still requires players to be stacked, so they still have to understand how your healing works. But they are still quite strong. They're just not as strong as they were.
Okay, another question from Cloud. Why did the team decide upon legendary powers over, say, another set or another tier of masteries, or seeing what could emerge with 5 more soul points? And Harumph also asks, it's related, why did the team decide on a maximum of 3 legendaries per soul?
So I'll start with the first part. So we looked at probably a half dozen different things we could do when Arcanics came to us and said, we're increasing the level cap. And then we got all of our initial fear out of the way. We were like, what are we going to do? Because we don't want to just add 5 more soul points. That's super dangerous because it opens up a bunch of hybrids we've never accounted for. And since a good chunk, like 75% of my days is squashing hybrids that are doing things they shouldn't, didn't want to make that worse.
Okay.
It really is.
Yeah,
About 75% of my days
I
squashing
totally get
stuff.
that.
So going in and saying, okay, we want to look at a different system. And we looked at a handful of different systems that were various flavors of go collect widgets that would buff powers that you'd put in slots that were cards that you'd upgrade that you'd smash together.
Oh, right,
and
right.
That design got out of hand very fast, and we kind of were throwing it around as a joke at one point. We jokingly even talked about you being able to go back to level 1 and getting a prestige point that you could spend somehow. That we didn't do that either, obviously.
Okay.
And so we want you to be able to get some kind of points that you can spend that feel cool. And we said, okay, so the best way to do that is pick some abilities that we like for various reasons or want to change for various reasons and say, here is a second version of that power that works entirely differently. One, this gives us big knobs we can turn for damage that says, hey, we want these hybrids to do better or worse or etc. and we can buff those hybrids. So for example, if I wanted 48 Assassin to be a much better build, I could buff Poison Malice a lot. And then you'd pick other things. But, we don't want to do that right now, but that's an example. That also lets us have pretty different gameplay rotations from spec to spec, depending on what's in the legendaries. As to why we chose 3 per legendary, we didn't want you just dumping all 5 points in one place, because in-soul things are going to be more efficient than out-of-soul things. So having to pick 2 sub-soul options was kind of an important part of that build design, and we designed things specifically that were sub-soul choice. So if it's low in the tree, as 0 point or 2 point or 4 point, it tends to be for other souls to take. You won't get a lot of use out of it in your current soul.
Okay. I'm going to address a couple of questions that have come up here. Raincloud and Rainkeeper, they're probably related, actually. Elves, right? I'm guessing elves. Raincloud says, you're basically telling us what we're going to play, and Rainkeeper says, why are you squashing hybrids? Let us play what we want. Now, that's an interesting concept.
So we do want you to play what you want. However, when hybrids are doing 60% better than the other options, one, it makes the game way more punishing for a new player to get into, because it creates what we call noob traps. Things that seem like obvious good choices to a player that are actually penalties. So, for example, if I'm a new player joining the game and I buy a boost and I'm at 65, or I've played and I'm up to 40, and I'm trying to put all my points in one soul because it's unlocking new stuff for me, and there is stuff all the way up to 61, so you feel like that's a good choice. And if it's, half as effective as other things, one, it makes those end abilities terrible. There's no point in having them. And 2, it makes it really hard for a new player. They basically, to be effective, have to go to an external resource to get information. And that's not really a great player flow. Now, we don't want to make them impossible to play, right? We do want hybrids we want to try and let them exist. But if they're straight up better, they're really hard to keep in place. And any nerf we make to them nerfs the underlying soul that they're attached to. So power tends to get shifted into the end of the tree to keep them balanced. And it does eventually push you away from hybrids with those builds. So it's kind of a hazard of, if players stopped breaking things, we wouldn't have to keep fixing them.
Right, and Raincloud asks for them, why not just give us set builds? The reason for that is because
I've lobbied for that.
Yeah, because it's simpler, right?
I've lobbied for a bunch of different changes that are, realistically, we're not going to do, because 1, they're crazy expensive, and that's just not going to happen. The amount of overhaul that would take is not worth the effort at this point. because the game is what it is, right? It's existed as it is, and soul trees are a pretty integral part of that. So taking them out doesn't make any sense.
I think you'd see a mass insurrection.
Yes.
I think what I normally do, and I think what a lot of other players do, is they'll take a recommended build, whether you find it on the forums or in game where you see the presets. Or message boards, that sort of thing. I'll take recommendations from there, but then I'm going to customize it to suit my personal play style too. One of my favorite cleric classes is actually my druid, and it's a little bit different than other people's druids. I'll probably get thrown out of raids. Well, it was nice knowing you. But I do like the customizability, and I just can't imagine Rift without having all of that ridiculous amount of stuff to experiment with.
And that stuff works just fine in the world, right? For most of the world content, you can play almost any build you want. And the reason we have to squash hybrids is in higher end content, or when someone gets to the outer edges of performance. Those things tend to be dangerous because they allow you to do things that you really shouldn't. They also, the players complain about balance. And if we allow just all of the hybrids to exist, people would be upset all the time because their hybrid that they really enjoy isn't as good as that hybrid that they don't play. And so solving that is a
challenging
nobody's going to be happy with whatever we choose here. So someone's going to be upset at me, and
I've
we're
had
opting
this
for the better
discussion
option.
with folks on the forums quite a bit. The fact that in any MMO, there are so many different play styles. Now that includes if you're a raider, if you're into PvP, if you're into PvE, if you're a role player. There are so many different play styles that people have that it's almost impossible to make everybody happy at the same time. Sorry, tacticians. Let me just, on a related note, Dunkulst asks, how does PvP factor into class balancing? We've had a lot of discussions about warfronts in the forums recently.
PvP factors an amount that is hard to gauge at any given moment, because when we're still making big changes to DPS, it's kind of in the back of our minds. It's one of the last things we think about. Because until the meta for any particular set of builds has settled down, it's really hard to make targeted PvP changes. We can make educated guesses as to what we think is a good choice, but because what works in PvP does change based on what other things are currently working, it's closer to guesswork than we're really comfortable just making random changes. So we like to say, okay, we're going to get these balance changes out of the way, and once they're in PTS in a solid state, then we can think about the major PvP implications of those things. And we're trying to play less class whack-a-mole. We're trying to make less changes every week so that specs are not changing out from underneath you every single week. We obviously want to fix things that are egregiously ruining the game, but ELO reports have a couple of builds that are too high right now, but not so far out of line that they need an emergency fix yesterday. Like, nothing is 2,000 to everyone else's 1,600.
Okay. Dunkelst also writes, there are some class changes on public test server. What are you looking for in terms of testing there? Do you read the feedback threads, look at in-game data, or both?
I do read the feedback threads.
I know you do.
I do. It is sometimes soul-crushing, so please be less shitty in there sometimes, guys.
Yeah, well,
I do have to read all
That's an
that.
important thing.
I'm human, goddammit.
Don't do the name calling, because the longer we go along here, we have fantastic feedback that comes in. Incredibly rational, thoughtful feedback, and then we have people who just come in and call Keyens names, and I'm done with that. We're not going to let that happen in our house anymore, because there are so many people providing good feedback that if you want to be one of those guys, you can go do that somewhere else. But how do you, do you read the feedback threads and then go check out what they're saying in data and find out if that's true?
There's a little bit of everything. So everything I read in the feedback threads is going to be taken with a grain of salt, because one, it's going to be a little bit reactionary, because that's human nature. People tend to react to change rather than process it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that on the face of it. However, it does mean that whatever feedback you're giving needs to be tempered by what somebody else says. It also means if you say something hyperbolic, I'm likely to ignore you. If you go in and say, this soul is absolutely worthless, one, that's not feedback, because I can't do anything with that.
You can't act on the term worthless.
Yes. Right. I mean, because I could just buff it by an amount that I think is anti-worthless, which is just some number I make up, but that's not helping anybody either. So if you get feedback that says, Ranger is one that's gotten some complaints, and Ranger's hard to balance because it's supposed to be accessible to newer players, but if it's also one of our top DPS options, it tends to overtake other things and nobody plays anything else. So it's kind of this weird middle ground that it's always hard to deal with. But if you go in and say, Ranger's worthless, I don't really have any feedback to act on there, because I hate this isn't feedback. It's just a reaction. It's an emotional response to something. Now, if you go in and say, hey, Ranger for me is always worse than Marksman and it doesn't play as well, that's an approachable problem, right? Marksman maybe should be a little bit better, maybe it shouldn't be, but saying, oh, it's below Marksman for me, that's a number I can compare against.
Okay. And I know that somebody asked about Rangers later, so we'll come back to that. Martimars asks, and this is an interesting one because I've now seen 3 updates that you've posted on public test server for the soul changes, and Martimars asks, when do you expect the changes currently on PTS to go live?
These are part of 4.1. So
they're part of 4.1.
I was originally hoping that these were going to be early January, and further reflection has said that maybe they should just be part of a major patch. I would love to get away from playing class whack-a-mole every week, largely because I know what I'm scheduled for the next 6 months, and it's going to make it very difficult to play class whack-a-mole. So we want bigger blocks of changes that we then can make small love taps to, rather than saying, every week I need to fix something that's out of control again.
We don't quite have a date on 4.1 yet. I know that we're working towards announcing it, but Arconix is still on PTO. That guy took an actual vacation this year. He comes back next Monday. He'll find me sitting on his desk camping his spawn, because we're going to work on getting a producer's letter out for you guys so that we can scope out what we're doing in the coming year, and we'll soon find out the fate of Chris Meyer. It'll be great.
What I'm working on?
What you're going to be assigned to. The impossible goals. Bishujo asks, any insights into new Primalist souls coming, especially AoE heal?
I have no insights to offer there.
Question answered.
That's one for Arconix and Vlad. So,
oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. Hey, Vlad, I know that you're in the chat. Pipe up. We want to hear that.
Is he?
Yeah, he is. I saw him talk earlier.
So he's still on PTO.
I know he is. None of us can
Go
say.
home, Vlad.
We have a really bad habit of being on PTO and logging into this stuff anyway, because we're gamers and this is our hobby as well as our job. All right, so Fate Stay Night is asking specific questions on something that you said doesn't really exist, but let's see if you can tackle this. What's the balanced DPS target? For example, what's the average ST DPS a full ST soul should do? Paragon, Assassin, etc. What's the average ST DPS a Cleave Hybrid spec should do? Reaver, Warlock, etc.
So I'm going to give the boring answer, which is for a purely single target soul, which is something that does exist, and we are trying to normalize that a little bit better. But in pure single target, we want them all to be plus or minus 10% of the median. Sorry. This means the top performing spec will be about 10% better than the middle, and the bottom performing spec will be about 10% worse. This would be about as tight as any game out there is. I know Star Wars was at like 7% from median for a while, which was really, really good. World of Warcraft at last check was like 30% top to bottom from middle.
Yep.
So, even no matter where you go, there is going to be difference from top to bottom. What is median, though, is a good question. Sure. It's not one that doesn't... For the test case I've provided to the specific test group, it's 300K, give or take, 310. But for the average player, it's, varies based on gear and player skill and a bunch of other things. One of the reasons we use alpha groups is specifically because of that. We're not going to get raw volume enough from enough players with a measurable item level differential that we can control. So we can't just say, oh, I want to look at this bracket of gear, this player performance, look at the DPS numbers. So given that, eliminating player skill and gear is the best way we have to balance.
Okay.
Yep.
Paladin says, AoE-based souls. Would the team consider the idea of moving away from AoE-based souls and allowing all souls to do some AoE? This is because over the years, the need for any real pure AoE souls has never been particularly high, and it opens up a lot more choice.
So this is a tough question, because AoE does have some value in rifts and world content and things like that. It's hard to have AoE souls. Because if all you do is AoE, anytime there's not other targets, you're basically worthless. And if you're God when there's 8 targets, anything intermediate is going to feel really awkward. So if there's always 3 targets and you're competitive with single target, there might be a reason for that to exist, but we don't really have any specific long-term plans for this is what AoE means, this is what single target means. We are, as you notice with Reaver, we've kind of said, hey, this has a single target performance and it has a big switch that says turn on AoE mode. We're trying to narrow that down so that cleaving and single target kind of fit together. and AoE is as of yet undetermined fate, so to speak.
So here's where Baladin also reveals that he or she knows a whole lot more about how this stuff works than I do. Would the team consider allowing souls to toggle into different roles? For example, creating a toggle ability with a CD cooldown for BM to increase all DPS but disable support abilities. Similarly, this could be for tanks to go full DPS but disable threat and most defenses.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no, because it said that we're toggling it, and Vlad will have a conniption. But even at a design answer level, one that tends to cause aberrant behavior, because what's the right answer for how do we handle those support cooldowns? Do you just press all of them, then push your button so that you're effective again? That's really weird. Does it cancel all of those buffs that are out? That's really weird too. So it's really hard to communicate to a player what the intent of that is. So at a general level, we're shooting for not that.
Okay, so Baladin, who I gather it must be Baladorf here in the chat, but on the forums, Baladin, yeah, dwarf, male dwarf, dwarves. Also asks, and I like this one, would the team, let me do this in the right voice. Would the team consider community suggestions for new souls? I would love to see an axe thrower for warrior, for example, if I were to suggest one.
So as a general rule, you can write whatever suggestions you want. We tend to pick based on different criteria than what a particular player might think is interesting.
So seriously, axe thrower.
Not on the table currently.
I will keep petitioning on this.
The next warrior I wanted to do was cannoneer. So
cannoneer?
Yeah.
Really?
Big cannon. Yeah.
Really? Can I have an axe thrower if you have a cannoneer?
I mean, I got to build both, so no.
Okay. And finally, Baladin says, there are several bugs with classes as listed in several threads, such as Punishing Blow, Legendary Not Affecting Thunderous Strike, and Champion. Does the team have a set window they aim to fix the bugs by, and could we get any insight into how the team approaches bug fixing?
So this is actually a general software question. So, God damn it, one Kata Mage just went by again. I'm not making that, Nick. It's not happening.
Totally writing that down.
No, don't write that down.
You keep talking. I'm writing this down.
So there's actually an interesting nexus that is a three-dimensional graph that everyone, when they see a bug, they think about it in their head, which is the relationship of importance to urgency to how long it takes to fix. So if it's important but not urgent, it tends to sit on the back burner until time says we can fix it. And if it takes a long time to fix and it's important but not urgent, it tends to never get fixed because urgent things take precedence. If it's urgent but not really important, and it takes a long time to fix, it also tends to not get fixed because it's not important. So
this sounds like a hell of a logic puzzle. Is this what you're faced with every morning when you come into the office?
So when I look at my JIRAs, I have to think about things I'm scheduled for that I have a deadline for that need to make it live that players want, and things that are broken and how long it takes to fix them. So if a bug takes 10 minutes to fix, that tends to get fixed pretty fast. If I don't know how long it takes to fix, it tends to sit until I know I have time to go look at stuff, because bugs can be anywhere from 10 minutes to 10 hours. So great example of that was we had to fix something for Chloro, which is we needed to allow cross-healing because LFR might put two Chloromancers together, and having one of them just be sad all the time is not an okay answer. So I looked at what makes cross-healing not work on Chloromancer, and this I thought was going to be an hour or two of work, and it turned out to be like 6 hours of work to make it do anything I wanted it to do. So, and this was after testing, I don't know, a dozen different options. So it's not trivial most of the time to fix something. So bugs we do fix when it's important and when it's urgent and when it's something that's super busting live. When it's less urgent, we tend to fix it when time allows. So it's kind of a judgment call we have to make on the fly. And there are times where Jira bucket starts to fill up and Vlad comes over and is like, hey, fix all your Jiras. And then I go fix all my Jiras, which usually takes a couple days.
Yay, Vlad. All right, a new set of questions from Jotun. Can you tell us if the armor and resist scaling and its values on the dummies and mobs are working properly?
So as far as I know, they are working properly, but Vlad built all of that. All of that comes from a very complicated magic spreadsheet that does a ton of crazy math that I have not delved into carefully enough to know how it works on the surface of it. So Vlad's going to be a better answer to that, but we can ask him when he gets back.
So what you're telling me is that class balance is really a matter of high-level mathematics as applied to a fantasy environment.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Is this what you wanted to do for a living?
I've always wanted to make games. It's the only I've ever wanted to do.
Huh.
So.
Well, that's good, because you're in here pretty late a lot of nights.
Or early some mornings, depending.
Okay, so I'm also going to pass the next question on to Vlad.
They're all the same. They're all related to that.
They're all related to that. So
all your resist related questions. Yes, we do balance given whatever the current resist values are. If they're busted, I'll have to go make changes.
Right.
That's the reality.
Okay. Jotun also asked, will the tooltips ever be updated with what I'm assuming was an intentional change to pretty much all skills to now have 1% variance?
So not every ability was updated. I think we updated most of the healing, and we updated a bunch of souls. I'm pretty sure it was close to all of them, but I'm not sure everything got hit. But basically, if it has 2 numbers, it's probably updated because those are all drawn by magic tooltips. If it only has 1 number, it shouldn't have variance in most cases. And if it does, it's variance upward, so you always win in that case. The answer is we're probably not going to go update all those tooltips right now. As we get bugs that are like, hey, this tooltip isn't the right thing, we go fix it. So.
Okay, Danera asks, I'd like to know how balancing affects other stuff in the game, how attempting to balance one class affects how another class is balanced, and for that matter, how attempting to balance classes seems to cause bugs in areas not related directly to the classes balanced, like how adjusting a spec or soul causes a quest not to complete. This is that weird, strange, arcane stuff that happens to software everywhere.
So this is the question otherwise known as why I drink. Anytime we change any class of any kind, it's going to affect other classes relative to it. And this is why lots and lots of things are more and more personal only, for example. So Pyromancers had this problem of, we wanted Firestorm to be an amp that for anyone that used fire is a cool, like, this could be a synergy. And then it turns out that's super dangerous, and everyone builds fire specs, and you stack them. That's not okay. So most of the time it's either an oversight or something sad that just was like, hey, we thought this would be really cool, and then players are like, hey, we're going to break that. That's why we can't have nice things. So obviously keep breaking those things because we don't want someone to be exploiting them under the scenes, but that's why we can't have nice things. And that's generally how it breaks a quest, right? If we give someone a teleport that doesn't have like targeting rules, they can sometimes teleport past triggers, they can sometimes kill stuff before it's supposed to, or kill stuff when it shouldn't be killable, right? There's all sorts of things that can happen there. And the content system does use the ability system. So sometimes it does something with an ability, like your companions in Starfall are generated by an ability, and sometimes you can click it off, sometimes you have to turn it on, and that can interact with other abilities in ways that aren't really foreseen. So for example, Saboteur Charges were breaking an ability early on in the game, the one where it turns you into a troll and you have to look at all the things in Stormhearth. And it's just a weird case where an ability broke something because it wasn't tagged right.
Wow. Yep. Okay. So yes, very complex. Biomass, are you going to adjust the physical damage reduction of level 70 NPCs, or is it intended to be 8% higher than the non-physical one?
That's the same as the resist question from before for Vlad.
Okay, Vlad, you're getting a whole bunch of questions. I'll collect these up and I'll see if Vlad has the time to answer them, and then I'll post them.
The answer is I think it's working like it's supposed to, but I don't know for sure what the intent is. Because armor and resists are 2 different systems, even for critters. And enemies, NPCs, whatever we call them here.
Dunkelstad had another question here. How are bursty specs balanced? Should they achieve similar DPS compared to a non-bursty spec over longer fights?
So this is actually an interesting answer. If you are just testing on a dummy, the longer you test, the closer they should be together. But all things equal, if both are up on a target 100% of the time, the sustain spec should do more damage. This is because a sustain spec is punished much more heavily when it has to move away from the target. So if you're a ranged burst damage spec, delaying burst is fine in most cases. If you're a ranged sustain spec, anytime you're not on the target, you're just straight up losing damage. So you lose way more damage than the burst guy does because he tends to group all his damage up. So all else being equal, they should be different. It's hard to account for that because counter design gets involved, and that's going to vary. So.
Dunkelst had a number of very complex multi-part questions. Multi-part. I mean, this was really good stuff. Healing souls. If I recall correctly, one goal will be less playing yo-yo with the tank's HP. How can this be achieved across hopefully all classes? How are hit points, SPS, and cooldowns balanced internally? What about shielding? Will we continue to see Purifier the go-to pick for tank healing?
So one of the ways, this is actually an interesting question that I've been talking to the content team about this week. we do want tank health to not be either in one of three states, which is empty, 15%, or full.
Right.
That's not very compelling for us. It's hard to design around for the raid guys, and it's tough for a healer, because if you miss something or make a minor mistake, it can basically lead to a death. It's also led to some of the reliance on battle reses in our game, because the damage is so high. So one of the ways we can solve that is by increasing player health pools faster than we increase healing, which is something we're already doing, already did, more specifically, and I'm going to talk to Vlad on Monday about more adjustments to that, which basically means something that used to drop a tank to 15% is actually going to drop a tank to 85%, and so the healing to damage ratio will be about the same, but it doesn't just insta-give players who are hit by it.
Right.
Yeah. And then there was a related question there that I totally
How
lost
did
track of.
Chloromancer and Libchanter fit into all of that, given that they were able to both group and tank heal?
So we are trying to move away from catch-all healers as a thing. You'll notice on the PTS, Chloromancer's life-giving veil got buffed, but not whatever the other one is called, LBV. Basically, inadvertently making their tank healing weaker relative to their potential. So Chloromancer is an AoE healer at its core, and it does healing by how long your cast times are, not how much damage you do. Read your tooltips better, people. Come on. And while it has single target tools, which are fine, and that's cool, and it's part of the spirit of the spec, and we don't want to just take that away unless we really, really have to, we do want it to not be, oh, let's just bring a bunch of Chloromancers to raids. That's not okay. So saying that it can do both is pretty dangerous, especially because we want to, we want to be careful how we walk that line. So better delineating between the two is important without making them unfun to play or killing the spirit of that spec.
Okay. Seeing as we're talking about Chloromancers, we might as well dig into this. Rainstorm says, default Mage Chloromancer Veil's damage reduction penalty. Mage Chloro has long been a favorite healer due to heals being based off the damage they do, but you say that's not true.
Right, so it actually, as far as I can tell, hasn't been that way for a really long time. Chloromancer currently, the heal that comes out of a particular trigger is based on how long the cast time is.
Okay.
So 1 second spells, 2.5 second spells, 2 second spells, instants, they all heal for different amounts. They also heal for different amounts based on whether they're life spells or not life spells, but how much damage you do is completely irrelevant. Their damage could be 0 and they would still heal for the same amount.
Very interesting. Okay. Is the Veil's damage 90%, 40% nerfing of the Mage Chloromancer's soul intentionally done to phase it out as progression rate healing capabilities?
Quite the reverse, actually.
Okay.
So the reason that Veil penalty is on there is because I made cross-healing available to them. What we didn't want to happen was, oh, every raid is going to rock a tank and 19 Harbingers with Chloro, 8 points in Chloro, and they're just going to heal each other by accident. That's definitely not an okay use of that. So we needed to look at ways we could adjust that, and ways that are okay to work inside the system are relatively limited there because of how all the Veils work. They do a lot of AoE checks, they do a lot of underlying rules that are things they either can't modify or shouldn't modify or don't want to modify for various reasons. And so before anyone goes to the forums with, I have a great suggestions for how you can let this go, don't do that, because I spent about a full day, like 12 hours on this, and there's what it has now is one of the few ways we can make this work without, a horrible compromise that nobody wants. Because I could just nerf all Chloroveil healing forever.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so that's the other option.
Because then I'll have to come over and stab you with my green pen.
Yeah, so there's that. And that helps solve that problem pretty fast.
Now, I see a completely off-topic question that has come up a whole bunch. The baby goat that was on the live stream last week is still not named. I'm going to make Ren the Blurry name it because she helped out with the birth of a lot of these baby goats. Ren the Blurry, a lot of the names that were suggested have already been used by the herd, so can you please pick between Darling Nikki and Roxanne for the baby goat name, and you can announce it to the stream.
So you said pick. What you really meant was, here are something we
Choose
already wanted to
between
pick.
the two, because of the ones that were suggested. We've already used
sure,
most of them, so there we go.
That's a good excuse.
And no, we're not giving away baby goats. No, wait a minute. Yes, we're totally giving away baby goats. Just come out to our farm, come get some. Okay, support souls. If I recall correctly, Bard and Oracle are meant to be more defensive supports. Will their DPS be comparable to each other, but lower than BM and Archon?
So anything related to support souls, I don't have an answer for yet because I haven't looked at it. It's likely that their personal damage will probably be similar, but their actual contributing damage will be lower because, BM and Archon have damage increasing things. So they will cause more damage total, even on a dummy, because they're going to get to use their support cooldowns.
Right.
So not using any cooldowns, they'll probably be close, but once cooldowns get involved, that won't be true anymore.
Okay, so BM, which is Beastmaster, is currently way over the top with pet-focused legendary abilities, they assert. Is it an option to go back?
It's true.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it an option to go back to the player being the majority of the DPS contribution?
So this current BM has not gotten a lot of opinion either way on the forums that I've been tracking, or Republic opinion, so it's possible to change those legendaries so they affect you more. It's kind of interesting to have a soul where you can amplify your pet, and it does kind of ridiculous flurries of numbers. I haven't seen a huge outcry either way, so unless I really, really have to, it's probably not getting changed.
Now, I'm sorry that I'm going to skip some of the questions. They're related to ones that we've already answered, but it's already 4:20, and nothing to be read into the number 420.
I've got nowhere to be yet, so
Yeah,
if we want to keep answering questions, I'm fine.
Okay, that's cool. So, we're going to go to Harumph. Harumph says, and I've wondered this myself, a primalist question. Curious to know how the focus bar factors in during design and balance. Instead of just having a cooldown, now abilities can have a cooldown, a focus requirement, and a focus change.
So when designing, this is actually a bigger element when we design the soul. We tend not to adjust their focus costs once they're live, because focus is how we inform the flow of a soul. So things we want you to, they either provide large goals, like in a Maelstrom, which is fill it that way, or they provide a flow like Dervish has, which is go back and forth. So in these cases, we can basically say, okay, this is what we want it to feel like going back and forth. So Vulcanus does a good job of this, especially if you're familiar with it at the early levels, where you start at Perfect Harmony, you move over to full, you Molten Wave, you end up back in Cunning, you get back to Perfect Harmony, you press Moment of Brilliance or whatever it's called, and then the whole thing repeats. And so it informs what button you want to press next based on value. And so this is kind of something we use all the time.
Okay. And then also, let's see, who asked this one?
Earl.
This was, no, this
he's
isn't
going
for-
back.
Dunkelst, yeah, I'm just going to go back a little bit
Jesus,
to a
whole
related
page.
thing. I know, just to get the name. Dunkelst asks, I know a prime AoE heal spec is going to come sometime, but see, there you go, you're committed. But until then,
it's going into someday.
can we please have some more AoE heal abilities, or just have ones we currently have to be more effective? Serenity is more of a utility for Deluge and Estuary. It is a real low heal, which even gets reduced by each successful chain, which makes it really undesirable. I'm still unable to heal through Skarn.
So the answer is unlikely, because making band-aids that I know I'm going to have to solve in the foreseeable future is something I try to avoid doing, because it just creates more difficult work down the road, and it makes it hard for players to understand what's going on. So depending on what Vlad and Arconics end up saying about Primal Souls, I'll make a different judgment at that time. But for the time being, not touching it until I know more from them.
Okay, and then back to Harumph. A Primalist and Legendary question. Is it tougher to balance the Primalist Legendaries? Most souls get a buff and cooldown at the 61 root, which seems like an easy target for Legendaries. Primalists, however, usually get their hardest hitting abilities at the 31 root. Seems like it should or would cause balance issues, making it legendary.
So it's not especially difficult. It does influence how we adjust their rotations a little bit. People who are Maelstrom fans will notice this, because Vaporize went through a couple different editions.
Yes.
It's because we can stick passives on there as well as secondary things. It's not that difficult, because we have lots of ways to just say, I need to turn another knob. So we usually add something.
Okay. Frosty has some questions that are specific to PvP
Okay.
and builds. What can be done to allow melee specs to become more viable in PvP?
So this is a difficult question, because it relates heavily to our ELO balancing and a couple of other things. We're getting current reports, so melee is always going to be slightly behind, because the ability to damage someone when they can't damage you is always going to be a pretty good thing. So we don't want to just make them hit harder, because that breaks PvE balance pretty badly, assuming the radii aren't screwing melee too hard. So we can adjust melee and range differently for PvP with global modifiers, but we tend to try and do that only a little bit. Large sweeping changes to PvP are things we try to measure out for specific goals.
Okay.
So.
Frosty also asks, are range specs intended to have such high burst in PvP?
It's not specific that range specs necessarily do. They appear to have more, because they, one, you see them more often, and two, they can do it more consistently, where they don't have to get close to anybody.
Okay. And thirdly, how much crowd control should ranged specs have? Should ranged souls have pulls like Dervish does?
There's no specific answer for that. PvP balance is a tough thing in a game where PvP is not the only thing that exists. When it exists in a vacuum, PvP is actually a lot easier to control because you get win-loss rates and you just bounce around that. Atlas Reactor has this benefit.
Yeah.
I know Peter sent out the tweet of their win-loss plus-minus. It's wildly more complicated in Rift because we have so many more vectors that player power scales on. So there's not a great fixed answer to that, unfortunately.
All right, so now we're into, I specifically said in the thread, try to keep it away from individual classes, but we've got a lot of these, and we've got a little bit of time, and unless Cole has a pressing social engagement somewhere? No, he doesn't. Yeah, this is our lives. All right, Riftologist says, what is your view on Dominator? What do you like? What do you not like?
So I have
Any planned changes for Dominator in 2017?
I have really complicated feelings about Dominator.
Oh. On Facebook it says, it's complicated.
So this largely comes from the games I've worked on in the past and having had CC as a full archetype all to itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's never been a thing that we've been able to balance. One, because the best CC is murder, but if you can chain lock things down forever, that's almost as good because it lets you bring, less tanks or less, more damage. So it's this really difficult thing to balance because if we keep it as a CC soul, which is what it is,
right.
One, everyone needs one, and that's not a thing we're adding short term. Or two, it needs to be so weak that you never care, and so there's no good answer. So realistically, I am not a huge fan of Dominator. I understand the power fantasy it's trying to fill. I understand why people like it, but it's very hard to support, and it's one of the reasons it's where it is right now. I don't have any planned changes for it. I would love to overhaul it somehow, but that's a very deep thicket of things to get into. So
very interesting. Okay.
Someone asked what we balance around. So for the test case, they're actually using a simulation of rank 9 fragments. So if you're using rank 6 fragments, the test case is still higher than that. Yeah.
Make Clerics Great Again has asked, how do you plan to balance out Primalist? What do you think, and this came up a lot of times, I'm just going to read this one, but lots of you guys posted
this. Is talking about the one-shots in PvP.
Yeah, what do you think about them being able to hit people in PvP for 90 to 100k plus hits, back-to-back killing highly geared people in under 2 seconds?
So this is part of the complex question of, one, they probably shouldn't be able to one-shot people. That's
okay.
However, their ramp-up is so high and that they need to line up so many things to make that happen. If we just take that away, they're not valuable at all. So there's a much more complicated set of questions to answer there.
So how long does it take them to ramp up, do you think?
It varies from soul to soul, but I know Maelstrom needs a couple of things to happen all at once. Dervish ramp up is at least not 0. The Aftershocker build is kind of broke, so I'll be breaking that someday soon here. Vulcanist needs the stars to basically align to make that happen. So it can happen, and it probably shouldn't. But fixing it is a much more complicated problem than it seems, because we can't just go nerf it and make them worthless.
Okay. Slipmat says, what are the plans for Chloromancers? It looks like the decision was to turn Chloromancer into a pure healing.
So one of the things we're trying to do is normalize how much damage healers do, and it's really skewed on live because of how much healing is required right now.
Yeah.
If you don't require much healing, you have more cycles to do damage with. So if you're pulling parses from live as a comparison, one, they're probably not accurate, and two, they're not indicative of how they're actually going to function in content that's pushing your healers. So this is a tough question to answer, but we wanted to normalize the damage healers doing more strongly. So Chloro is probably going to get more changes, because if they do more damage than other healers, and they're competitive healing-wise, they're just straight up better.
So basically you can't have it all.
Yeah, you can't have it all, and I think taking their damage away from them is just going to be a better answer overall, because it means they get to be healers like they're supposed to be.
Kukuvap says, any consideration being given to a tactician nerf?
Already did.
Yes! Okay, that was easy. PvP feels too fast-paced recently. Please increase time to kill as it was after 3.6 patch.
I'd have to talk to Vlad about it, but there's a good chance we're going to try and do that at some point. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a couple of people asked, but Baladin, or Baladorf as he's known here
No.
on Twitch,
No.
Path of the Hurricane, bring it back! Or if not, why not?
Because it's totally going to break things.
What's it going to break?
Well, it's a
I'm
really
curious.
strong AoE.
Oh.
Vlad's also using the art for something else, I think, right now.
Oh, so Vlad's using the art for something else. Please go
Yeah, he
form
was
the
doing-
line to complain at Vlad's
Yes,
desk.
blame Vlad. That and
No,
Blood
but
Fever
you
because
feel
Vlad
it
said
was
so.
just overpowered then.
Yeah, it's for
That
for
explains why people want it back.
for the kit that is, especially for the kit around it right now, it's probably too good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nazuki says, is there any possibility to bring back Harbicon, which is the Harbinger Archon hybrid?
So I'm gonna nip this one in the bud right away. We're trying not to bring back specific hybrids. Balancing around that is a rabbit hole that never ends, and it's only going to make things worse.
Okay,
I know
okay.
people think they want
let
that.
Me let me present the rationale here. I think you wouldn't even really need to nerf the damage because you need 100% buff on slashing attacks and plus 60% on cast time abilities to make 61 Harbinger even remotely viable. Harbicon was the best support spec in my eyes, not only because of its damage output, but because of its flow in playing the spec. That flow comes purely from the Harbinger 1 second global cooldown and proc playstyle.
We'd rather fix Archon's playstyle to be more fun in that case.
Okay.
Before you guys keep going, I
Yes.
actually have a work meeting, not a social engagement,
Bye.
unfortunately. But
Come on
if
back.
you want to start, or if you want to stop the stream when you guys are done, just hit that button over here on this machine,
Okay.
and it'll
Got it.
stop.
Totally will. Bye.
Yep.
It's all ours now. It's great. All right, so we're going to be here for the next 4 hours.
Oh,
No, that's
no.
not true.
Oh, God.
No, we're down to like two pages
I
now,
got,
so
I got
that's
things to do
great.
tomorrow.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Fate Stay Night. Now, Fate Stay Night, dude, madam, whatever. I'm going to just ask you, when you're posting to the forums, try not to use terms like useless, worthless, that sort of thing. I have rewritten your questions to present to Chris here.
Hyperbole makes it seem like you don't think through things very much.
Fate Story Night feels that Rangers are not effective in serious high-end content, while other pet callings like Druid or Elementalist remain more viable. Can you comment on Rangers?
This is probably true right now. Rangers are eternally hard to balance because of where they want to be as far as the edict of they're approachable to new players, and
They
don't
like to be one-shot guys.
well they don't
I'm
have
married to one.
Yes, they don't have a lot of the tools in their baseline kit that were easy to tweak for Druid and Elementalists that made them super powerful. So their rotation and their flow are just fundamentally different. So it's much harder to make broad sweeping buffs to them. And when they were the best, we got complaints that, oh, Rangers are too good and nobody wants to play anything else because they're super easy to play. So it's kind of this catch-22 for us.
So is it true that the more powerful classes or the more powerful combinations are typically more difficult to play?
So this is something that gets raised a lot. One of the things I know I would like to try to do, and I think Vlad agrees, is we don't want player skill and difficulty of spec to be a huge scaler because, one, it makes it hard for the content guys to balance anything. Because the best players in the game playing the hardest specs to play are so far better than the average player that it's basically impossible to balance anything. And this is a problem we've struggled with. So making specs a little more consistent and challenging players with mechanics in the fights is a much better answer. And so spec difficulty to play probably shouldn't be a scaler on performance. And if a spec really is that difficult to play and you feel like it should be doing 30% more damage, the spec's too complicated and needs to be simplified. So.
Okay. Fate Stay Night also feels that ranged viability in rogues has been nerfed significantly. Can you comment on the reason for this adjustment?
That's pre-marksman buff today. So the main
so
reason
what you're saying is Fate Stay
marksman's
Night,
much stronger.
go
now.
on to public test server and try out marksman.
So the main reason for this was all of marksman damage was in a couple abilities, and I wanted to spread it back out into other things. You pressed a couple other buttons every once in a while, and to do this, I needed to slap their other buttons pretty hard before I could figure out where I needed to make an adjustment that said, okay, this is where this needs to go. So hitting one button specs and hitting spam and power shot for all of your damage. Sad man, not an okay build. Gonna fix that.
Okay. Multi asks a question that relates to something that I don't know because I've never used this. Legendary cadenza. Are you familiar with that?
It has to do with the energy cost.
Okay,
so it's still costed like a 2-second channel.
Multi says that legendary cadenza is worse than its non-legendary version.
That's straight up an oversight. It is because of how expensive it is. It costs.
Okay.
It's an instant basically, or 2-second cast or something like that. But it costs like a long channel, and it's just too expensive. That's largely an oversight on that particular button.
So that's something that's in line to be fixed. There you go. It's in line to be fixed. Okay, great. And then Multi also follows up with, will you at least keep free-to-play souls close to the pay-to-play souls? For example, Assassin doing competitive DPS and being close to Shadeborn so raiders don't feel forced to buy paid souls.
So this is a really hard question to answer because we don't intentionally make particular specs that are paid better. However, anytime they add new tools, it's going to be really hard to make not having them equal. A good example of this is if you are a mage and the Chloro nerf is something that you can't play around. You're not going to take Legendary Bloom and you don't think it works for you. If you don't own Frostkeeper, your healing options are going to be limited, and there's very little I can do about that. And what I can't just do is buff it so that, hey, you can, if you don't have Frostkeeper, you can heal for just as much as if you do have Frostkeeper, because then you just heal for twice as much if you do own it, and it is straight up better again. So it's this weird kind of circular logic problem that says, hey, if they're adding new tools, they're going to feel a little bit better. If they're not adding new tools, it's much easier to keep them balanced. So Shadeborn is probably a little high right now, or Assassin's a little low. It's probably a little bit of both. So fixing those is pretty easy because they don't really provide straight up different tools. So it's much easier.
Right. I want to mention that the intention of offering the additional souls as a purchasable option is simply to afford you a little bit more variety. And it also helps to pay for wages for this guy, for me, for the servers, for the electricity that helps us run the live streams and so on. But we do try to make them as reasonable as possible. And then, of course, Disbo follows up with Purifier, and Disbo quotes a person by the name of Scourge in the official feedback thread. Purifier Ward of Fire Legendary is bugged, and the shield component is only being buffed by 3% per stack instead of 30% per stack, which probably has a lot to do with how weak it feels.
So it looks, I've actually looked at this, it looks like in a vacuum it is working the way it's supposed to. What is probably happening is that particular buff is in the same layer as some other buff. So if you already have a large percent buff to something and you add another 30% to it, it's a much smaller buff. So it won't necessarily feel right. But if you test it in a vacuum, I actually think it's working. Purifier, now that the Frostkeeper nerf on PTS is out there, is in a much better overall place. Same with Sentinel. Divine Favor also got changed today, so you're going to have to learn how to heal again. Sorry, clerics, you'll get over it. It's better for you, because now we can buff you again.
Okay.
But it's in a much better place overall. It's why they got the eruption change that they did today. So.
And Disbo also has a question about Oracle. Any plans to increase DPS for Oracle? It's not a preferred support spec.
I mean, you haven't tested the raid yet, so that's a little premature. They can make you unable to die for 8 seconds, which people seem to keep forgetting. But not yet. We haven't looked at support yet. So.
And then finally, amazingly enough, we've made it to the last question here, and it's because a lot of these have been combined, but Jotun goes back to, and I know you guys have been asking about this, Warrior. Yes, Warrior.
Mm-hmm.
Warrior, I was under the impression that the pet system was too difficult to manage and made it work well enough, to make it work well enough, hence the changes to Elementalist pets and Druid ones a few months ago. Why on earth is a Beastmaster now a full pet soul where the player is mainly just the buffer for the pet?
So this is partially because the power fantasy is substantially different. A Beastmaster is
what?
the power fantasy.
The power fantasy.
So when we make souls or specs or anything like that, we try to think about what power fantasy.
Oh, you mean like Axe Thrower?
Yeah, like Axe Thrower.
Okay.
Yeah, moving on.
Or Wankata.
Things that aren't happening. Equilibrium, sorry. So this case is Beastmaster isn't really magically driven. And so the thing that made Elementalist and Druid work that we thought we could get away with lore-wise without feeling like it was just a straight-up Band-Aid solution was this is actually something reasonably that we could tie into the lore of those classes. And we do think about this when we make changes. I would love to be able to make changes with no concept of lore or reality or anything like that, but it turns out people yell at me when I do that, so we make some concessions.
Are you talking about us role players?
Yes. Yeah.
Probably my fault.
I've seen some of the things that get written.
Yes.
So in this case, we didn't actually add anything new to the pet itself. It functions exactly the same way as it used to. So we didn't actually have to use the pet system in a different way. I just attached a bunch of buffs to it, effectively. So it didn't have to do anything new, and the power fantasy seemed to fit. If people don't really love it, then we can change it. It's kind of low on my list of things to worry about at this moment, because raw damage dealers and tanks and healers are a slightly more pressing issue. So.
Now, one thing I have to do, because we've come to the end of the questions, and I apologize for the ones, there was some overlap in some of them, and I didn't want to get into too much repetition. Keyens comes over to my desk almost every day to talk about stuff that he's read on the forums. And it's really interesting because I knew immediately that this would be a really great idea for a live stream. As you can see, he has a whole lot of information, and there's a lot of thought that goes into these builds. If you have a couple more questions, we'll do that until Cole gets back. But in the meantime, we also have a.
Someone realized what my shirt is. It's Schrodinger's cat. It's the math behind Schrodinger's cat.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool, and that explains class balance as well.
Pretty much.
Is it there or is it not there? We have just a few giveaways today. We're going to give away 1 standard Starfall Prophecy, 1 deluxe Starfall Prophecy, and 3 Void Drakes. As usual, if Ren the Blurry or Rough Raptors win, we'll give away twice as many of said item. All right, I'm going to make you read all of these. Is that all right with you?
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Oh, okay, cool. By the way, thanks for doing this. This was awesome. Okay, the first...
It was this or Keep Nerfing Healers,
yeah,
so...
We'll get... Jeez. Okay, while you guys are Xing up, and by the way, if you've said anything over... They're Xing up. Xing up, yeah? You X up. You X up for raid, you X up for prizes, etc.
Yeah, that's what it is.
If you guys want to test out the new changes to the souls, and there's a lot of them, check on the PTS thread on the forums where Keyens has marked down. There's 3 separate ones that he's done. A lot of changes have come in. 4? Good Lord. Yeah, the last of them went in today, that's right. And then go on to public test server this weekend and see what you think about the changes. Okay, so first we're going to do Standard Starfall Prophecy goes to...
Horton 24.
Horton
See, I can pronounce that one.
24. Did Horton hear a who? The Deluxe Starfall Prophecy is going to...
Is it an L?
Yes.
Hellfire
TV.
TV.
Hellfire TV. Okay.
I got my see things that are closed glasses on.
Great.
Can't read it.
Okay, now we're going to do 3 Void Drakes. They're super cool looking.
Ianto Charles 1.
Yanto,
right?
Yeah, I think
or
so.
Lanto. I can't
Yanto Charles 1.
You know who you are.
You know who you are. You're getting something. Something. Second Void Drake goes to...
Crypto. Oh, Crypto.
Oh, Crypto.
You got a purple avatar of some form. You know who you are. I can't see what
I think most people know, it's... okay, it's not ak.
Well,
That's
if my
right.
name was Oh Crypto with a C, I would be really excited right now until, I just said that I just said.
That's true. Okay, the third and last Void Drake goes to...
Heisenberg LOL. Well, that's appropriate.
That's great.
I'm sure they mean the Breaking Bad character, not the physicist.
Yes, I'm fairly sure.
It's just disappointing.
Okay, guys, I really appreciate you being here. And Keyens, thank you so much for coming on. The guy speaks very eloquently about stuff, and I just wanted you to be able to hear what goes into these class balance things. Are they ever going to be perfect? No, which is why 75% of his work is spent constantly tweaking and poking things. As the game evolves, and it evolves every time we put out new content, there's some evolution. Every time we put out, see stuff that's happening in PvP, there's some evolution. So it's never going to be finished, and we appreciate all of the input that you have. And again, although he can't specifically use your parses, if you use your parses to support some of the things that you're saying in support or asking for changes to a specific class, that's also very nice. Just try to keep civil and decent, and remember that this is a human being, and he really cares about you. He cares about the game. He cares about every class except for Dominator.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the callings. And I was like, I care about all the callings. Although the nicer your calling is on the forum, the sooner you will get me to post something for you.
So for those of you people who are asking about Warfronts and PvP, I'm going to make sure we get somebody on stream to talk about that next, because I'm very curious
God, not
about
me.
that too. No, not you. I'll drag some other
thank
poor
God.
hapless soul in here.
Make Krug do it.
Yeah, no, Rough Raptors, we are not doing a silver tier. I'm fairly sure that Arconix is already going to take a strip off me for doing that before Christmas, so I think we're done here. And thank you guys all very much. Please go try out the new soul changes on the PTS. Let us know what you think. There are feedback threads up on the PTS section of the forums. And let's all go out there and play some Rift this weekend. Have a great weekend.
Behave. I swear.
Behave.
Monday morning threads
Yes.
are always the worst because no one's looked at it all weekend. And you just wade through it and it's like, Oh, it's
Okay.
just like garbage
Monday
fire.
morning threads, because we've already gone over and Cole's not here to kick us out.
Exactly.
Monday morning threads are when Keyens comes over to my cube and he hangs over the top and he
And I
goes,
cry a little bit.
I just can't.
Yeah, I can't-
just,
I can't do
I
it
just
anymore."
can't go on anymore. Be decent.
Y'all
We
can
love
be real
the
hurtful.
opinions.
Y'all can be real hurtful.
You're pretty tough.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
thank
yeah.
you guys. Now I'm going to go over and find the shut
Yeah.
off stream button. Have a great weekend, all. Oh, you're going to find it? Okay,
it.
good. He's going to do it.